I didn't call the police when I found the carcass. I called my brother Mark, which, in hindsight, was the first mistake, maybe the second. It wasn't the smell that got me, though that was bad enough, like old pennies and spoiled meat baking in the August sun. It was the surgical neatness of the whole thing. A clean white tarp had been laid out, big, industrial-grade stuff, covering a patch of pine needles about 10 feet wide. On it sat the deer, not gutted, not dressed for meat, just arranged. Its head was placed carefully on its flank, the spine severed right at the neck like someone had used a bone saw, and then there were the pockets. Someone had taken a razor blade and sliced open 4 perfect pockets of hide, 2 on each side, over the ribs, and stuffed something inside. Something that looked like money and dried moss. That was 2 days ago. Right now, I'm sitting in the shadows of the old fire tower, the air thick and cold even though it's still early evening. Mark is down below, messing with the padlock on the tower shed. I still haven't told him about the money. Mark and I weren't hunters. We were just trying to scatter Dad's ashes where he always said the air was the cleanest, up at the summit of Black Peak. We parked my beat-up truck 5 miles back on the access road, deep in the Blackwood National Forest, the kind of woods where the sun only hits the ground around noon. Thick, ancient trees that feel like they're judging you. We hiked in for 3 hours before I spotted the tarp. Mark was 20 yards ahead of me, complaining about his blister. I'd stopped to retie my boot and saw a flash of white through the underbrush, maybe 50 feet off the trail. When I walked over, my heart went from a normal beat to a hummingbird flutter the moment I saw the setup. The deer was big, probably a 12-pointer, and dead maybe 12 hours. After the initial shock, the bizarre, ritualistic why of it, I noticed something else. A trail. Not animal tracks, but a clear, heavy drag mark in the dirt leading away from the carcass uphill. I called Mark back, but I didn't let him get close enough to see the pockets. Found a huge buck, Mark. Looks like a poacher took him and spooked before he could finish dressing it. Fresh kill, probably just minutes ago. Mark, ever the pragmatist, shrugged. Bad luck for the poacher, let's keep moving. But I couldn't, something was wrong. The air felt charged wrong. I pulled out my cheap plastic poncho. The deer's blood was everywhere, and carefully, stupidly checked the pockets. The moss was just moss, dried out, almost dusty. But the money, $20 bills, crisp and stacked tight. I counted the bills from one pocket, $600. Multiply that by 4 pockets, and you're looking at $2,400 stuffed into a dead animal like it was a perverse piggy bank. Who does that? I didn't tell Mark. I scooped the money out, carefully wrapping the bundles in my own handkerchief and stuffing it into the deepest part of my pack. I covered the carcass again and walked away, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. What kind of message was that deer? And who was it meant for? We hiked another 2 miles, the money feeling like a heavy, hot stone against my spine. We didn't make it to the summit. A sudden, unexpected storm rolled in. Not rain, just a dense, heavy black fog that dropped the visibility to nothing. The kind of fog that swallows sound. We stopped at the fire tower, an ancient wooden structure long since abandoned by the Park Service. It's 9 p.m. now. The fog has cleared, replaced by an ink-black night with no moon. Mark managed to break into the shed and found an axe, a few rusted cans of beans, and a military-grade flashlight that still worked. We set up a miserable camp under the tower. "You're jumpy, Mike," Mark said, stirring the cold beans over a tiny, smokeless fire we made from deadfall. "It's just these woods," I lied. The truth was, every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep, and I kept imagining the person who left the money, not a casual poacher, but something cold and focused, looking for what I had taken. "They're just trees, man. Relax." But they weren't just trees. They were shadows, thick and aggressive, pressing in. I hadn't even told Mark about the trail I'd seen leading away from the deer. A trail that went straight up to where we were now. The fire tower wasn't just on a trail, it was a destination. The first sound came around 11:35 p.m. Not a loud sound, just a single, sharp crack of a branch breaking, maybe 50 yards down the hill. Too loud for a raccoon, too deliberate for the wind. Mark froze. The light of the fire flickered across his face, making his eyes look huge and black. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," I whispered, pulling the small hatchet we'd found near the shed towards me. We sat motionless for a full minute, listening only to the frantic pump of blood in our own ears. Then, a low, guttural noise, not a growl but a kind of hissing whisper. "Coyote?" Mark asked, his voice shaking just slightly. "Coyotes howl, that's not a coyote." Then the voices started, low, indistinct, talking too fast to make out words but definitely human. They were close, too close, and they weren't yelling or looking for help, they were conferring. "They're talking about us," Mark breathed. He scrambled backward until his back hit the cold wooden supports of the tower. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it hard into the darkness, but the beam just bounced off the wall of trees. Nothing, but the voices stopped instantly, as if they knew the light was coming. Why did they stop? Were they watching the light, or were they waiting for us to react? We huddled together. The fire was dying and the night was getting colder. I could feel the paranoia creeping in, coiling around my throat. Was this about the money? Did they track the scent of the money I had touched? Or were they just killers who saw a couple of easy targets? "We have to get off the ground," I said. The old tower was rickety, but at least it offered a vantage point. Mark was already halfway to the ladder. We scrambled up the 40 feet in near total darkness, pausing every 5 rungs to listen. The voices didn't return, but the silence was worse. A palpable, heavy quiet that felt like being held underwater. We finally reached the enclosed cabin at the top. The windows were dusty, but intact. Inside was a mess of rusted equipment and mouse droppings. I locked the flimsy latch on the trapdoor behind us. Mark took the flashlight and started sweeping the room. "Look," he pointed. On the main observation desk, someone had neatly piled up a dozen empty shotgun shells, all the same gauge, all recent. "Someone uses this place regularly," I whispered. Then Mark pointed the beam at the floor near the corner. It wasn't dust. It was a dark, rusty stain soaking into the old wooden planks. We weren't just running from something. We had climbed straight into their lair. The money felt like it was burning a hole in my pack. I couldn't keep this secret anymore. "Mark," I started, my mouth dry. "Listen back at the deer." Before I could finish, a sound echoed up the ladder well. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Someone was climbing. We stood frozen. Mark gripped the axe so tightly his knuckles were white. The noise stopped directly below the trapdoor. We could hear heavy, measured breathing. Then a soft, chilling sound. A low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump against the underside of the door, like someone tapping a heavy ring against the wood, or maybe a slow, deliberate knock. "Get away from the door," I hissed, yanking Mark back towards the far wall. The knocking stopped. A new sound started. A slow, agonizing creak as something heavy was put against the hatch, followed by the sound of metal being bent. The latch was weak. It wouldn't hold long. Mark was hyperventilating. "We're trapped, Mike. What did you do?" I couldn't look him in the eye. "I found money stuffed in the deer. Thousands, I took it." His eyes went wide with pure panic. "You what? Are you insane?" Had I just condemned both of us for a handful of dirty 20s? The latch shrieked, metal failing. A powerful, gloved hand shoved up through the gap, grabbing the splintered wood of the door frame. I saw the flash of the wristwatch, digital, black, military style. "The window," I yelled. We smashed the nearest window with the axe handle. The drop was 40 feet onto a mix of rocks and broken deadfall. A suicide jump. But the hand was pulling the door open now, and a silhouette of a massive, broad-shouldered man was filling the gap. "Jump, Mark, now." Mark didn't hesitate. He swung his leg over the sill. I heard the sickening thud as he hit the ground and a strangled gasp that quickly faded. I looked down at the trapdoor. The man was fully inside now. He wasn't rushing. He was just standing there, a massive figure in dark clothes, his face hidden by a black watch cap pulled low. In his hand he held not a gun, but the hatchet I had dropped earlier. I scrambled back and went for the window. As I swung my legs out, the figure spoke, his voice deep and completely calm, devoid of anger or excitement. "Doesn't matter where you run. That black water runs down the hill." He wasn't talking about a creek. He was talking about the stain on the floor. I pushed off, falling hard. The wind was knocked out of me and a spike of pain shot through my ankle. I landed in a pile of wet leaves and pine needles. The flashlight was gone, the night absolute. I heard the man step to the broken window above. "You took what wasn't yours, Mike. You just borrowed trouble." He knew my name. How did he know my name? I hadn't seen him. I hadn't told anyone but Mark. I crawled blindly, ignoring the pain in my ankle, scraping my hands raw on the roots and rocks. I couldn't call out for Mark. I didn't know if he was alive or if the man was waiting for me to make a sound. The $2,400 was still in my pack. It didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the impossible question. How long could a man outrun a killer who already knew his name in the deepest, blackest part of the woods? I crawled until I hit something soft. I reached out, my hand closing around the cold, stiff fabric of a canvas jacket. Mark. I leaned in close. He was breathing, shallow and ragged. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle. "Mark, we have to move," I whispered. Before he could answer, a heavy, measured footstep landed right next to my head, the sound of pine needles crunching under a boot. I froze, heart hammering like a trapped bird. The figure didn't say anything. He just stood there, the sound of his breathing the only sound in the universe. Then the rhythmic thump, thump, thump started again, not on a door this time, but on his own thigh as if he was impatient. I could see the silhouette of his boot 2 inches from my face. I could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and stale blood. If he was standing right there, why wasn't he moving to finish it? What was he waiting for? I squeezed my eyes shut, not wanting the last thing I saw to be the sole of his boot. I waited for the hatchet to fall, knowing that in these woods, the silence before the scream is always the loudest part. Story 2. I've never believed in ghosts, not until the woods started copying me. It started subtly, maybe 3 days into the trip. My name is Alex. I'd come up here to the vast, forgotten tracts of the great northern wilderness, ostensibly to finish writing my thesis. The truth, I needed silence. Real, crushing, absolute quiet. I had found it. My cabin was 9 miles from the nearest paved road, miles from even a logging track, perched above a small, stagnant lake. My first few days were perfect. Coffee, writing, the smell of pine and damp earth. Then the imitations began. Day 3, mid-afternoon. I was chopping firewood, swinging the axe in a slow, rhythmic arc. Thwack, stop, lift, thwack, stop. After one particularly hard swing that split a knotty piece of maple, I heard it. A second, delayed thwack, maybe 100 feet off into the timber. Not an echo, not exactly. An echo fades. This was a clean, full sound. The sound of a second, heavy axe hitting wood, a second after mine. I froze, heart hammering. I'm deep in regulated wilderness. There are no other cabins, no other campers. I dropped the axe, waited 5 minutes and heard nothing but the buzz of flies. I chalked it up to strange acoustics, maybe a branch snapping under delayed pressure. That was the easy explanation. But the easy explanation never holds up in the deep woods. The next day it escalated. I was sitting on the porch eating canned chili. I lifted the heavy enamel mug to my lips. Clink. From the woods just beyond the perimeter of my small clearing came a distinct matching sound. Clink. I lowered the mug slowly. The sound was wet, metallic, and close. I picked up a small pebble from the porch floor and threw it into the nearest rhododendron bush. Thump, rattle. A second later from the same spot. Thump, rattle. It was like a child playing a cruel game, but there was no laughter, no movement, just the perfect mimicry of my actions. Was I being watched, or was something simply mirroring me? I decided to test it. I stood up, walked to the edge of the porch and cleared my throat, a loud, intentional rasping sound. A single, rasping cough came back instantly from the trees. Fear, hot and sharp, pierced through my academic calm. I grabbed my hunting rifle I'd bought for emergencies and never fired, and retreated inside, bolting the door. It was nightfall now. The cold seeped through the thin walls of the cabin. I had turned off the generator to save fuel, so I was sitting in near-total darkness, illuminated only by a kerosene lamp that cast anxious, swaying shadows. The silence was overwhelming, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but full of waiting. I was trying to write, pretending that the pressure cooker of my mind was just overactive, that the sounds were just environmental tricks. At 1 a.m., the temperature dropped hard, and then the imitation started again. I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm my nerves. A deep, shaky breath returned from outside, right next to the cabin wall. I shifted my weight on the chair. Creak. A fraction of a second later, creak. It was following my biorhythms, my subtle movements, my unconscious sounds. It knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. I stared at the back door. It had a small, scratched window pane. I didn't dare look through it. Then I heard something new, not an imitation but a direct action. A soft scratching sound at the front door just below the handle, like a fingernail against the wood, rhythmic and patient. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I held the rifle tight, my finger hovering over the safety. If it knew everything I was doing, why was it only scratching now? Was it trying to draw me out? I crept toward the front door, moving as slowly and quietly as possible. I put my ear to the wood. The scratching stopped. The silence returned, but this time it was broken by a faint, dry clicking sound. Not from the door, but from the roof. Click, 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 click. Like something with long, insectal legs was slowly traversing the shingles directly above my head. I backed away, sweat slicking my hands on the rifle stock. Whatever this was, it wasn't just mirroring me. It was investigating me. Then the clicking stopped right over the center of the cabin, and the floorboards beneath me gave a sudden, loud groan. The force came from above, as if something incredibly heavy had dropped onto the roof. The light fixture above me rattled violently. Whatever was up there was definitely heavy, definitely not human, and definitely intended to get in. I didn't wait. I ran to the back room, grabbed my pack, and shoved the small, portable spotlight inside. I couldn't stay. Being cornered in this little wooden box was a death sentence. I slipped out the back window, landing silently on the damp earth. The cold air hit me, sharp and clean. I didn't look back at the cabin where the groaning was becoming continuous, rhythmic, a heavy weight shifting back and forth on the roof. I ran downhill, toward the stagnant lake. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed open space. I ran for 10 minutes until I stumbled and fell hard into a low patch of thick ferns. I pulled myself up, gasping for air, and realized I was standing next to something. A small, dry stone wall overgrown with moss. It was an old, abandoned well, likely dug by a long-gone homesteader. The wellhead was broken, a ragged hole about 3 feet across, surrounded by cracked stone. I stood by it, trying to catch my breath, listening for the sounds of pursuit. I heard nothing. The night was vast and silent, save for my own ragged breathing. And then I heard the breathing of the woods. It was faint but unmistakable, coming not from the surrounding trees, but from the well itself. Deep, slow, measured inhalations, as if something enormous was sleeping down in the darkness. I couldn't move. I had to know. I pulled the spotlight from my pack, flipped the switch, and pointed the beam down the black throat of the well. The shaft was deep, maybe 40 feet, lined with smooth, wet stones. The light hit the water at the bottom. It wasn't black water, it was green and murky, stagnant. I saw my reflection staring back up at me, my face, pale and sweaty, framed by the light. But as I watched, the reflection didn't quite track. I tilted my head slightly to the left. The reflection tilted its head slightly to the right. I raised my right hand to wave. The reflection raised its left hand to wave, but its gesture was slow, unnatural, like something operating under immense drag. I gasped, a sudden choking sound. The reflection didn't move or imitate me. It just held its slow, reversed wave. Then the face in the reflection smiled. It was my smile, identical down to the chipped corner of my front tooth, but it was a smile of pure, anticipatory hunger. I dropped the spotlight. It clattered against the stone wall and fell, spiraling down the well shaft. For a moment, the green water was lit up in a swirling tunnel of light. And in that moment, as the light hit the water, I saw not a reflection of the sky, but a reflection of the ground right next to me. The reflection showed my body standing next to the well, but it also showed another figure. Tall, gaunt, and absolutely naked, standing 3 feet behind me, its face obscured, but its mirrored arms already reaching out to shove the reflection of me into the well. If the water showed a reversed image of the ground right next to me, was the figure standing there right now, or had I seen something that hadn't happened yet? I spun around, rifle raised. There was nothing there, just the ferns, the trees, and the echoing silence. I backed away from the well, stumbling over the stone wall. I heard the heavy groan again, now much closer, coming through the trees. The creature from the cabin roof was approaching. I looked back at the well. The light from the dropped lamp was dying now, poolsing underwater. I realized the horror, the imitations, the scratching, the weight on the roof. It wasn't trying to scare me away. It was studying me, mapping my actions, learning how to be me. And the reflection in the well was showing me the completed transformation, the moment when the copy took over. I looked down at my hands, flexing them. Were they still my hands? I started running again, no longer just from an unseen threat, but from the horrifying possibility that the quiet, empty woods had finally managed to duplicate me, and that the original was no longer needed. How do you fight a monster that is wearing your face and knows your every move? I ran toward the deepest black of the woods, hearing a heavy, deliberate footstep echoing my own stride, keeping perfect pace, 2 yards behind me. Story 3. I never meant to find the money. I was just trying to lose the cops. My name is Jake. It was 5 years ago, but the smell of pine smoke still makes my stomach clench. I had just botched a simple heist, a payroll grab, and ended up running full tilt into the Appalachian wilderness. My partner, Vince, had been caught, and I was alone, deep in the thickest, most unforgiving woods the state had to offer, with a torn-up leg and a useless backpack full of supplies I hadn't properly checked. I spent the first 2 days just surviving, drinking swamp water and hallucinating from the pain. The cops were probably 5 hours behind me, maybe less, sweeping the ridges. I knew they wouldn't stop. They never do when there's an officer shot, even if it was just a graze. On the 3rd day, starving and shivering, I stumbled upon a clearing. It was perfect, hidden by a natural ring of massive hemlocks, and in the center of the clearing was a fire pit. Not a casual camper's fire, but a massive, deep pit lined with stones, still faintly warm. Next to the pit, partially covered by a rotting canvas tarp, was the cache. It wasn't money, it was equipment. 2 military-style shovels, a stack of sealed, oil-treated blankets, and 6 metal containers, the kind used for storing munitions. My hands shook as I pried the lid off the nearest one. Inside, resting on a bed of dry silica gel, were bricks of heroin, pure, uncut, vacuum-sealed. I lifted one. It was heavy. I looked at the 5 other containers. I wasn't good at math, but I knew this was easily in the high seven figures. Who was operating a lab this deep in the woods, and why had they abandoned this much product? Then I saw the other thing. Tucked under a stone, almost hidden, was a small plastic photograph. A picture of a man in his early 40s smiling, a clean-cut family man type, next to a massive custom-built RV. On the back, neatly printed in block letters, "For Elias, 30K. The realization hit me. This wasn't abandoned. It was a dead drop, a pickup point that had been set up, but the goods hadn't moved. And judging by the heat in the fire pit, someone had been here very recently. I forgot the police. Now I had a far more immediate problem, the owners. I did the stupid thing. I grabbed one of the shovels, dug a deep trench about 50 feet away, and buried the containers, covering the spot with dead leaves and broken branches. I kept only the picture, slipping it into my pocket. My thinking was simple. I needed leverage. If they found me, maybe the location of their stash would buy me enough time to run. That night, the real tension began. I huddled about 100 yards from the clearing, wedged between two granite boulders, trying to sleep. The woods were utterly silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. It was the kind of silence that tells you the top predator is hunting. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound I'd been dreading, a vehicle. Not a loud engine, but a faint diesel rumble miles away, slowly getting closer. It stopped somewhere up on the hidden logging road I hadn't known existed. Then came the footsteps, not the clumsy steps of a hiker or a cop, but the measured, silent tread of professionals. 2 people, maybe 3, moving through the underbrush with unnatural speed and stealth. They moved straight toward the clearing. I stayed glued to the rock, holding my breath, tasting the dust on my tongue. They stayed in the clearing for over an hour. I heard the faint clink of metal on stone. They were uncovering the cache site. Then, a low, frustrated growl. They knew it was gone. A voice, low and thick, cut through the night. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, furious, icy calm. Then the second voice. Clearer, younger, speaking with a slight Eastern European accent. It wasn't the police, Victor. The police wouldn't bother to bury it. Then someone saw the smoke, the first, older voice replied, even quieter. And someone is still here, find them. They haven't gone far, look for a drag mark. Look for blood. I pressed my face into the dirt. They were looking for a broken man with a ripped leg. I was easy to track. The thought of them finding the money picture in my pocket made me physically sick. They split up. I could hear their movements flanking me, 2 separate shadows moving like ghosts through the forest. I had to move, but I couldn't run. I took off my shirt, tore a strip of fabric, and tried to bind my lacerated shin. The pain was blinding, and I almost cried out. I made a terrible choice then. I started crawling uphill. I remember Dad saying that in these mountains, water runs down and tracks wash out, but if you go up, you lose visibility but gain the high ground. I crawled for maybe 30 minutes, my muscles screaming, the cold dew soaking my clothes. Then I heard a sound that made my blood turn to ice water, a match being struck. I looked down the slope. One of the figures, the younger, Eastern European one, had found my original hiding place by the boulder. He wasn't tracking me. He was just systematically clearing the area. He had a cigarette lighter out, and he was using it to burn the ferns and low growth, illuminating the ground for tracks, centimeter by centimeter. The smell of the burning leaves and pine needles drifted up to me, not the sweet smell of a campfire, but the acrid, chemical smell of forced combustion. He wasn't 300 feet away. I could see the glow of the lighter flame dancing against the dark leather of his jacket. How long until the heat of the fire hit my tracks, or until the smell of the smoke masked my scent, and I had no warning left? I kept crawling, silent and desperate, until I reached a small, rocky ledge. I stopped and listened. The burning had stopped. I heard the first voice, Victor, right below me. He is injured. I smell the blood. Look up. He will try for the ridge. They were right below the ledge. I was trapped. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the only piece of leverage I had, the photograph of Elias and the RV. I looked at it one last time, then pressed it into a thick slab of wet moss, hoping the rain would smear the ink and hide it. Then a glint of metal caught my eye on the ledge. A small, rusty wire snare, left long ago for rabbits, half hidden under a bush. I had one chance. I took the wire snare and looped it carefully around a heavy, football-sized rock. I crawled to the very edge of the ledge, directly above where I judged the two men were standing. I waited for the crunch of their footsteps to pass under me. The older man, Victor, passed first. I could have dropped the rock, but I needed a distraction, not a kill. When the second man, the younger one, moved into position, I let the rock fall. It hit the ground with a heavy, wet thud, landing maybe 3 feet from him, kicking up a shower of dirt and small stones. "Movement," the young man yelled, his voice cracking. "The rabbit trap, idiot," Victor snapped. But the damage was done. They had heard me. They knew I was above them. I threw myself backward, rolling off the ledge into a ravine that was choked with thick, dead brambles. The thorns ripped my skin, but the thick brush muffled my fall. I heard 2 distinct, powerful explosions as they fired their silenced pistols at the spot where I had been. The bullets thwacked into the granite. I lay still, buried under the thorns, listening to them scramble up the ledge. "He's running down into the hollow," the young one said, panting. "No," Victor countered, his voice chillingly calm. "He wouldn't go down. He knows we can pin him. He is still climbing. He is waiting for the cover of the sunrise. We go up, high and fast." They ignored the obvious. They assumed I was smarter than I was. They sprinted up the ridge, believing I was still heading for the summit. The knowledge that they understood my survival mindset better than I did, and that they almost certainly knew the truth. I waited until the sounds of their heavy boots faded completely into the high canopy. I was covered in blood, not just from my leg, but from hundreds of tiny thorn cuts. I crawled out of the brambles and started stumbling downhill, back toward the clearing, back toward the buried heroine. It was a terrifying contradiction. I was running away, yet running toward the source of the danger. My logic was fractured. They were running up the mountain, assuming I wanted to escape. But I realized now, in a cold flash of survival instinct, that I couldn't escape a group that tracked this well and thought this coldly. I needed my leverage. I needed the dope as a bargaining chip, and I needed it now. I made it back to the clearing just as the sky was starting to turn a bruised, pre-dawn purple. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought they must hear it miles away. I scrambled for the shovel I had left behind and started digging frantically, tearing the earth apart. If I was wrong and they had doubled back, I would be digging my own grave. I hit the side of the container. I yanked it free, scraped off the dirt, and held the cool metal box tight against my chest. Then I heard the faint, telltale snick of a bolt being drawn back, right behind me. "Good boy," Victor's voice drawled, slow and satisfied, right over my shoulder. "You came home." I dropped the box. I didn't need to turn around. I knew the cold muzzle of the weapon was pointed squarely at my spine. I closed my eyes and wondered if, after all this, the 20-year sentence from the payroll heist would have been the easier way out. Story 4. I woke up believing the woods were breathing. Not just the wind rushing through the pines, that deep, slow, inhale-exhale sound that moves air over massive lungs. My name is Sarah. I was backpacking solo on a remote section of the Pacific Crest Trail, miles beyond cell service, miles beyond any recognizable trail marker. I was seeking solitude, and I found it. The kind of solitude that feels less like peace and more like a vast, empty room where you realize you're not the only one inside. The first few days were fine. Routine is a great shield against paranoia. Then I stopped at a little stream crossing, and that's when I saw the stone. It wasn't a natural stone. It was a smooth, perfect orb of dark granite, maybe the size of a softball, and it was sitting right in the middle of a mossy log that bridged the stream. It was too regular, too centered to be random. It had been placed there. I picked it up. It was cold and heavy. As I held it, a strange electric tension pulsed up my arm. I looked around. The woods were dense, silent. No campsite, no footprints, just the endless green wall. I dropped the stone in my pack and kept hiking, trying to dismiss it as some kind of eccentric trail art. But the feeling persisted. I was being followed, or maybe just observed. That night I set up camp high on a ridge, hidden in a thicket of scrub oak. I kept my fire small, and I was careful with my headlamp. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard a sound that made my chest seize up. It was a soft, rhythmic clicking, like two small rocks being tapped together. It came from about 20 feet away, consistent, like a metronome set to a slow beat. Click, click, click. I pulled my knife out, holding the cold steel against my palm. Hello. My voice was thin, pathetic against the massive silence of the mountain. The clicking stopped instantly. The silence returned, now charged with awareness. I waited for an hour, heart racing, but nothing moved. I decided it must have been a branch swaying or a pinecone dropping. I was exhausted, and my imagination was running wild. I fell into a shallow, fitful sleep, only to be woken by a low, drawn-out screech. It sounded like metal grinding on bone coming from directly downhill. Then, silence again. In the morning, I packed quickly. I felt the urgent need to put mileage between myself and that ridge. As I pulled my pack on, I noticed something strange about the campsite. The stone I found the day before, the perfect dark granite orb, was sitting on my empty coffee cup, right outside my tent flap. I hadn't taken it out of my pack, I was certain. I remembered putting it in the deep side pocket. I checked the pocket. It was zipped shut and empty. Someone had been in my camp while I was sleeping. Someone had taken the stone, placed it neatly on my cup, and left without making a sound. My blood ran cold. Was this a warning, a test, or just a bizarre, intrusive game? I picked up the stone, the electric buzz returning stronger than before. I felt a rising sickness in my stomach. These weren't normal woods. This wasn't normal isolation. I started running down the trail, covering ground as fast as my heavy pack would allow. I didn't stop until early afternoon, collapsing near a thick, mossy boulder beside a dry creek bed. I pulled out my map. I was lost. The landmarks I was tracking, a triple fork in the river, a stand of burned timber, didn't match the terrain around me. It was as if the map was charting a different mountain range. I was trying to reconcile my position when I heard it again. The clicking, click, click, click. This time it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from inside the boulder. I pressed my ear against the cool, damp stone. It was hollow, and the clicking was definitely coming from inside, slow and rhythmic. I moved around the back of the boulder and found it, a small, dark opening, barely big enough for a raccoon, leading into the heart of the rock. I dropped my pack and grabbed my headlamp. I had to know. The paranoia was too thick to ignore. I squeezed into the opening, scraping my shoulders. The space immediately opened up into a small, cold, earthen chamber, a cave hidden inside the boulder. It stank of damp earth and something acrid metallic. I shone the light around. The walls were uneven, but the floor was perfectly smooth, packed down by time or use. And in the center of the floor was a small pile of objects, meticulously arranged. There were maybe 24 of the smooth, dark granite stones, all the exact same size and shape as the one in my pack. They were stacked in a perfect pyramid. Beside the pyramid was a little wooden box. I hesitated, then reached for it, my hand shaking. It was a small, ornate music box. I opened the lid. It didn't play a tinkling melody. Instead, it played a single, repeating, high-pitched whirring sound, like an insect trapped inside. Then I saw the final object on the floor, next to the music box. It was my original canteen, the aluminum one I had used for years. It was empty and clean, polished smooth, and stuck firmly to the side of the canteen as if glued was a single, bloody human molar. I stumbled back, hitting my head on the low ceiling. I scrambled out of the cave, vomiting on the dirt, the sight of that polished tooth a cold spike of pure horror. I didn't grab my pack. I didn't grab anything. I just started running again, full tilt, pushing through the thorny bushes, ignoring the pain in my lungs. It was late evening now. I was running on instinct, fueled by adrenaline and a growing belief that the woods themselves were sentient, and that the stone was a marker, a key. I heard the sun set, the sudden drop in light feeling like a heavy blanket pulled over the world. I finally stopped at the edge of a sheer drop, the forest giving way to a canyon bottom maybe 100 feet below. I couldn't go forward. I dropped to my knees, sobbing, the terror finally breaking me. Then I heard the soft, familiar sound closer than ever, the breathing. Inhale long, slow, profound. Exhale closer. It wasn't wind. It was massive right behind me. I pressed my face against the dirt, too paralyzed to look back. I heard a scraping sound, like thick leather dragging over stone, and then a strange, wet slap right next to my ear. Something had been placed beside my head. I slowly turned my eyes. Lying in the pine needles, perfectly centered, was the music box, the one I had left in the cave inside the boulder miles back. It was open. The high-pitched whirring was loud now, unbearable, and the sound of the breathing stopped the moment the music box started playing. I finally lifted my head and looked up, expecting a tall, monstrous figure. Instead, I saw only trees, but the trees directly surrounding me were different. They weren't growing straight up. They were bent over at the top, forming a tight, thick canopy like the roof of a colossal tent. And woven into the thickest part of the branches covering the sky was a complex interlocking mesh of small, dark granite stones, hundreds of them, the same perfect, cold orbs. They had been creating a nest above me, a roof, a cage. I looked down at the music box. The whirring stopped. A new sound came from the speaker, a low, distorted version of my own voice. It was the voice I used when I talked to myself on long hikes. The quiet, self-soothing monologue I thought only I could hear. "You should have left the stone, Sarah. You should have left it alone." The voice repeated the phrase, calm and patient. "You should have left the stone, Sarah. You should have left it alone." I grabbed the nearest stone from the ground and threw it as hard as I could into the trees, shattering the pattern above. As the stone broke the canopy, the rhythmic clicking started everywhere all at once, surrounding me. It was no longer the sound of two small rocks tapping. It was the sound of dozens of them, hundreds being shaken violently, like a colossal living maraca. And then a new sound cut through the chaos, coming from the black space between the stone-roofed trees. A sound I recognized from the night before, the long, drawn-out metal-on-bone screech. I knew then that the woods hadn't just been watching me. They had been waiting for me to settle down, to become comfortable in the center of their trap, and now they were closing in. I scrambled up, turning my back on the canyon, and ran headlong into the dense, clicking shadows, knowing I had lost my mind and my life to the granite orbs of the mountain. Story 5. The snap was loud, sickeningly wet and final. It wasn't the sound of a dry branch breaking. It was the sound of my tibia giving up. My name is Noah. I was 5 days into a solo wilderness photography trip, far north in the Klamath Mountains, miles from any trail. I'd been scrambling down a loose scree slope trying to catch the last light of the sunset on a granite spire when the rock shifted. One instant I was stepping, the next I was falling. I landed badly, my full weight twisting on my left leg. I lay there, winded, for maybe 2 minutes, tasting dirt and blood from a busted lip. When I finally pushed myself up onto my elbows, I looked down. My lower leg was bent at an angle that looked like something only bad taxidermy could produce. The pain wasn't a sharp throb. It was a vast, crushing wave that made the whole world go gray. My phone was dead, dropped somewhere up the slope. My emergency beacon was in my tent, a 6-hour hike back the way I came. I was alone, twilight was settling in fast, and I was immobile. I knew the rules of survival instantly. Control the bleeding, there wasn't much. Stabilize the limb, and get shelter before the temperature dropped. None of which I could do effectively. I managed to drag myself a few feet to a stand of thick, cold pines. I used my heavy camera strap and a small, straight branch to make a rudimentary splint, cinching it tight. The agony of moving the leg made me pass out briefly, but when I woke up, the darkness had almost won. That night was the longest of my life. The cold sank deep into my bones. The pain was a living thing, chewing on my leg, but the cold helped me focus. I built a pathetic nest of pine needles and small branches. I had half a liter of water and a granola bar. That was it. Around midnight, the temperature dropped below freezing. I heard the first sounds of the forest waking up, the scratching, the low growls, the rustling. Then, a new sound close enough to feel real. It was the sound of a very large animal coughing. A deep, heavy, wet sound, maybe 50 feet away, just beyond the perimeter of the faint glow from my small fire starter. It sounded like something was clearing its throat, preparing to speak. I slowly pulled out the only weapon I had, a multi-tool with a 4-inch blade. I held it tight. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The coughing stopped. The air settled into a tense silence, the kind where you can almost hear the thoughts of the thing watching you. Then, a single, sharp snap of a branch, immediately followed by the sound of heavy, measured steps moving away downhill. I spent the rest of the night shivering, waiting for the steps to return. They didn't, but the incident left a core of absolute fear in my stomach. The thing that coughed wasn't foraging, it was patrolling. Day 2 was worse. The sun was a joke, weak and cold. My leg was swollen to the size of a football, burning with fever. The sheer effort of moving was exhausting. I had to reach the creek, which I knew was about 50 yards downhill, where the heavy steps had gone the night before. I started dragging myself on my hands and knees, pushing off with my good leg. The pain of the movement was enough to make me scream, but I bit down on my sleeve until I tasted blood again. It took me 3 hours to cover 30 yards. As I crawled, I realized the full extent of my foolishness. The ground was littered with small, unsettling signs. Not just footprints, but the remains of small animals, a headless squirrel, a cluster of bird feathers, all placed near small, dry granite rocks. It looked like someone had been leaving offerings. I finally reached the creek. It was slow and shallow, freezing cold, but it was water. I drank deep, the frigid water shocking my system back to a semblance of clarity. As I rested, I looked upstream, toward a stand of twisted alders, and that's when I saw the structure. It wasn't a tent or a cabin. It was a shelter woven from thick, dead branches, maybe 7 feet tall, but completely covered in a dense, crisscross thatch of deer hides. The hides were old, dried, and incredibly dark. The smell of cured leather and something else, something sharp and animal, wafted down on the weak breeze. This wasn't an abandoned hunter's stand. This was a home. Who lived this deep in the woods, covered in hides? And why had they chosen a spot right next to the creek, right where I was? I froze. I was exposed, crawling in the open, and only 100 feet from a den that belonged to whatever coughed in the night. I saw no smoke, no movement. It seemed empty. I knew I couldn't stay, but I also knew I couldn't climb back up the hill. I had to go downstream, toward the nearest established trail, a brutal 7-mile crawl. I started moving, dragging my dead weight, trying to use the cover of the low bushes along the creek edge. The afternoon crawled by. The fever in my leg rose, making the trees blur and the ground tilt. I kept hearing things, whispers on the wind, the sound of my name being called, but I knew it was the heat in my blood. Around 5 p.m., I came to a place where the creek widened into a series of stagnant, shallow pools. The air here was heavy with the smell of sulfur and decay. And in the middle of the largest pool, half submerged in the greenish-brown water, was a backpack. It was a modern, high-end trekking pack, bright blue, exactly the kind of pack a hiker would use. I dragged it out, my heart pounding with a desperate rush of hope. If it belonged to a hiker, maybe there was an emergency radio, maybe a working phone. The pack was heavy, too heavy. I unzipped the main compartment. It was full of rocks. No, not rocks. Granite spheres, all smooth, all uniform, the size of human heads. And on top of the stones, neatly folded, was a single human scalp. Long, pale brown hair, still attached, the skin dry and brittle like old parchment. I gagged, shoving the bag away. It rolled back into the stagnant water. The scalp floated gently to the surface, the hair spreading out like seaweed. This wasn't an eccentric loner. This was a monster. And this was not a place to live, it was a place to collect. How long had that blue backpack been here? And was the owner of the scalp the person who was being tracked, or the tracker himself? I looked back upstream toward the hide shelter. I imagined the figure silent, covered in dried skin, carrying a shovel and collecting smooth stones. The fever made the vision horribly clear. Night fell again, fast and brutal. I found a small hollow under a fallen log and wedged myself in, using my jacket and pack for cover. My water was gone. I was running on pure, terrified adrenaline. I heard the sound again, much closer this time. The coughing, not directly toward me, but moving along the opposite bank of the creek, packing me. It was low, rhythmic, and it stopped whenever I stopped. I realized I was being herded. The thing that lived in the hide shelter knew I was here, knew I was injured, and was simply guiding me, patiently, toward a predetermined spot. I knew I couldn't crawl 7 miles. I had to fight or hide. I looked at my leg. It was an anchor, a death sentence. I made the final, insane decision. I used the razor-sharp edge of the multi-tool blade, held it against the tattered fabric of my pants above the wound, and started slicing. I carefully peeled the clothing and then the splint away. The cold air hit the raw, swollen wound. The pain was paralyzing, a white flash that made me bite so hard on my tongue I tasted fresh, coppery blood. Then I started to dig. I jammed the blade into the earth, frantically digging a shallow, man-sized grave right beside the log. I knew what I had to do. I had to disappear. I used my last surge of strength to drag myself into the shallow trench. I used my arms to pull handfuls of dirt, pine needles, and rotting leaves over my body. I couldn't cover my head completely, but I was mostly hidden, buried alive, trying to look like a small, damp rise in the ground. The coughing stopped directly across the creek. Silence, a profound, aching silence. Then a sound of movement, not across the creek, but right behind me. A slow, heavy footstep, the crunch of gravel and pine needles. The shadow that fell over my hiding place was immense. I could feel the heat radiating off it and smell the strong, musty scent of dried animal hide and something else, a terrible, sweet, decaying aroma. I heard a low, raspy inhale directly above me. The breathing. Then a single, soft, dry sniff. The thing was smelling the air above my hiding spot. The most terrifying sound followed, the gentle, measured scrape of metal on earth. It was holding a tool, a shovel maybe, or an axe, and it was lightly testing the ground around my head. I closed my eyes, silent tears mixing with the dirt on my face. My leg was screaming. I wanted to cough. I wanted to scream. But I stayed still, listening to the soft, patient sound of the blade testing the disturbed earth, knowing that if I moved even a muscle, the blade would stop testing and start digging. Could I stay silent long enough for the creature to decide I was just a rock, or was the pain in my leg about to make a sound that would give away my grave? The scraping stopped right above my skull. Then the immense shadow moved away slowly, the heavy footsteps fading into the night, leaving me alone, buried and broken, but still breathing. Story 6. I came here for the silence, but what I found was a sound that shouldn't exist. My name is Elena. I was a cartographer mapping remote, unclaimed forestry land near the Canadian border. The job required a level of deep isolation that suited me just fine. My camp was a small, high-quality four-season tent pitched beside an enormous glacial lake, a place where the water was so black and deep it looked like frozen oil. For 3 weeks, my only companions were the drone, the satellite GPS, and the crushing stillness. It started on day 17. I was taking a hydrographic reading near the shore, leaning out over the water when I heard it. A single, distinct, perfect musical note. It wasn't wind whistling or a bird call. It was the clear, sustained tone of a low cello string being plucked, pure and resonant, echoing up from the depths of the black lake. I straightened up instantly, heart hammering against my ribs. I looked around. Nothing but ancient trees, heavy snowpack on the high peaks, and the water. The sound died away, leaving only the usual sound of my own anxious breathing. I told myself it was geological, a shifting plate, a vibration traveling through the bedrock. But the note was too clean, too deliberately musical. The next day it happened again. I was heating water for coffee when I heard the note again, but this time it was followed by a second note higher and then a third. A simple 3-note motif, a melancholic rising progression. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the lake perimeter. Nothing. Not a boat, not a cabin, not even a hiking trail within 20 miles. The isolation, which had been comforting, now felt predatory. I started talking out loud to myself just to break the suffocating silence. That afternoon, I was walking the shore, marking the water line, when I found the thing that proved I wasn't hallucinating. It was lying half submerged in the damp mud at the water's edge. A small wooden device, the color of aged mahogany. It was intricately carved, about the size of a loaf of bread, and looked like a cross between a musical instrument and a delicate old fishing reel. It had thin metal wires stretched across a carved, hollow chamber. A hydrophone, a listening device, was attached to the bottom. I picked it up. It felt heavy and strangely warm. The metal wires, when lightly touched, resonated with that low, clear tone. Someone hadn't just been here. Someone had left a very specific tool to interact with the deep water. I took the device back to my tent, wrapping it in a dry sack. I didn't tell my contact on the sat phone. I knew they'd pull me out, claiming psychological stress, and I needed to know the answer to the chilling question: who was playing music in the deepest part of this hidden lake? Night fell, bringing with it a deep, absolute cold. I was zipped inside my tent, staring at the small wooden instrument. My imagination was a runaway train, a submerged research station, a cult, or maybe something older, something non-human responding to the strange, low frequency. Around 1 a.m., the temperature inside the tent plunged dramatically. I heard a sound from outside that was terrifying precisely because it was so human. A slow, deliberate footstep on the wet, sandy shore outside. Not a heavy boot, but the soft, scraping sound of a shoe or perhaps a bare foot. It moved past the tent door, paused, and then moved back. I grabbed my utility knife, holding my breath so tight my ears started ringing. Then the music began. It wasn't coming from the lake. It was coming from the wooden device I had tucked inside the dry sack, 2 feet from my head. The cello notes, low and haunting, started playing themselves. Not randomly, but a structured melody. A simple, repetitive 5-note phrase that felt immensely sad and incredibly old. I knew I was being listened to. The notes were a direct response to my presence. I snatched up the device and threw it across the tent. It hit the wall with a dull thud, but the music didn't stop. It actually grew louder, swelling, filling the small space. I looked down at the wall where the device had landed. The nylon fabric was pulled tight, and I could see a faint bulge pressing against the outside of the tent, right where the device was playing. I realized then that the device wasn't playing itself. Someone was touching it, manipulating the wires from the outside of the tent. I scrambled for my sat phone, my hands shaking so badly I dropped it in the dirt. Before I could retrieve it, the bulge moved. It wasn't a hand. It was long, thin, and moved with a jerky, unnatural articulation. It slid along the tent wall, tracing the shape of my sleeping bag. I held my breath, frozen in the dark. The music stopped instantly. Then the breathing began. Not the heavy, animal breathing of the woods, but a shallow, rapid, rhythmic sound. It was coming from maybe a foot away, separated from me by a thin layer of nylon. It sounded like someone hyperventilating in silent panic. The sound was so disturbing, so clearly a sign of profound human distress, that it broke my fear for a second. "Who's there?" I whispered. "Are you hurt?" The hyperventilating stopped, complete silence. Then a new sound, a soft, desperate scratching at the zipper pull on my tent door, like someone trying to slowly, carefully pull the zipper down, one tooth at a time. I knew that if I didn't move, whatever was outside would be inside in 60 seconds. I grabbed the music device, ran to the back of the tent, and used my knife to slash a massive, ragged tear in the nylon wall. I pushed myself through the gap, scrambling out into the bitter cold night. I ran blindly toward the trees, the black water of the lake, a shimmering, terrifying presence on my left. I glanced back at the tent. The zipper was fully open now, and the beam of my headlamp caught a fleeting glimpse of something inside. It wasn't a person. It was long, thin, and silver white, coiled on the floor of the tent like a massive, metallic snake. It was the source of the frantic breathing, the sound of air rushing over cold, wet metal. I didn't try to understand. I ran. I reached the cover of the nearest cluster of thick cedar trees and collapsed, hiding the small, wooden music device under my chest. Then I heard a different sound coming from the lake. Not the deep cello tone, but something much higher, piercing and fast, like a flute or a piccolo. The melody was frantic, a counterpoint to the low, sad notes. I looked back at the tent. The silver-white thing had dragged itself out of the tent and was now moving quickly along the shoreline toward the water, writhing as it moved, like a piece of living conduit. The flute-like sounds were drawing it in. Was the low cello note a way of calling it, and the high flute note a way of calming it, or perhaps controlling it? I knew I had the key. The wooden device in my hand was the source of the low music. I slowly pulled it out from under my chest, my hand still slick with cold sweat. I decided to try the one thing that made no sense. I held the device out and plucked the thickest wire. A deep, booming cello note resonated over the lake. The silver-white thing on the shore froze. It stopped writhing and lifted a thin, flat head toward the sound, tilting it unnaturally. I plucked the next string, playing the second note of the sad three-note motif I had heard earlier. The thing hesitated, then slowly, agonizingly began to turn, not toward the lake, but toward me, drawn by the sound of the low, commanding music. I had attracted its attention, but I didn't know the rest of the song. I played the final, rising note of the simple progression. The creature moved, not slowly, but with a sudden, impossible burst of speed, gliding over the moss and stone straight at the edge of the cedar grove. I scrambled backward, dropping the musical device. It landed with a final, booming chord that was loud enough to hurt my ears. Then everything went silent. The silver-white shape stopped right at the edge of the trees, maybe 20 feet away. It waited, motionless. The silence was heavier than the music, heavy with cold, intelligent awareness. I knew that I had initiated a conversation with something that had been waiting, silent, in the deep black water for years. And now it was outside my shelter, waiting for the next note. I was alone, miles from help, facing a choice. Either stay perfectly silent and wait for the dawn, or play the terrifying music and see what it demanded next. I listened to the sound of its shallow, metallic breathing in the darkness, knowing that the real horror of the deep woods isn't being alone, but realizing you've invited something home. Story 7. The smell of gasoline and scorched earth was what woke me up, not the pain in my ribs. My name is David. 2 days ago, I was driving a stolen pickup across the state line with a duffel bag full of marked cash. The plan was clean: dump the truck in the Ozark National Forest, hike out 3 days later, and disappear. The reality was a high-speed chase ending with the truck wrapped around a 1,000-year-old oak tree. I crawled out of the wreckage with a fractured wrist and some busted ribs, just seconds before the fuel tank blew. Now I was a mile deep in the woods, injured, without food or water, and watching the black smoke plume up into the clear sky. The cops wouldn't need a search team, they'd just follow the smoke. I spent the first day dragging myself eastward, away from the access road. I knew the only chance I had was to get to the old, unmapped mining trails where the woods got too thick for helicopters. The cash, almost 50 grand, was still in the duffel bag slung awkwardly over my good shoulder. It felt less like a payout and more like a lead weight dragging me down. By the time the sun set, I had found a shallow, dry creek bed and wedged myself under a tangle of roots. The air was turning bitterly cold. My ribs felt like razor blades scraping against each other every time I took a breath. I had to focus on the immediate problem: the cops. But around 1 a.m., I realized the police weren't my biggest problem. I was lying there trying to keep my shivering under control when I heard the sound. Not a siren or a boot crunching pine needles, but a low, deep groaning. It was a mechanical sound, rhythmic and heavy, coming from somewhere uphill through the pitch-black timber. It sounded like a massive old machine turning over very slowly. Too slow for a generator, too heavy for an animal. It was a grinding, unhappy sound that felt like it belonged under the earth. I pulled my rusty pocket knife out, the only weapon I had, and waited. The groaning stopped. Then a new sound, the distinct metallic clink of a chain, or maybe a length of heavy cable being dragged over rock. It was moving downhill toward the creek bed. I pressed myself flat into the mud, trying to become part of the root system. The dragging sound moved past my hiding spot, maybe 20 feet away. Whatever it was large and heavy, and it moved with agonizing slowness. I held my breath until my lungs burned. After it passed, the silence returned, thick and tense. I waited another hour before daring to move. When the pre-dawn light finally seeped through the canopy, I risked looking at the ground where the sound had passed. There were no boot prints, no tire tracks. Only a single, deep, clean trench gouged into the earth, maybe 6 inches wide, cutting a straight line through the creek bed and continuing downhill. I followed the trench, forgetting the pain and the police. The need to understand what had made that sound was overwhelming. The trench led me about a quarter mile to a small, isolated clearing, hidden by massive rhododendrons. And there, in the center of the clearing, was the machine. It was an impossible thing, a rusted, ancient Winchen cable system anchored deep into the ground. The cable, thick, oily, and heavy, ran from the machine across the clearing and disappeared over a sheer, vertical cliff face. The winch drum was the source of the groaning. It looked like something from a 19th century oil rig long abandoned, but the cable was taut, glistening with fresh oil. And next to the winch there was a structure, a deep, dark hole in the earth, maybe 4 feet wide, lined with rough-cut stone blocks that looked like they had been dragged up from below. It wasn't a mine shaft. It was a well, but impossibly deep, the air rising from it smelling like metallic steam and ozone. Why was this industrial-grade winch, deep in the woods, hooked up to a dark hole that wasn't a mine, and who was dragging the heavy cable. I crept closer. The only thing near the lip of the hole was a small, heavy wooden lever bolted to a piece of granite. It was the brake for the winch, and etched roughly into the side of the lever was a single word: eat. As I stared at the lever, I heard the sound of a voice. Low, muffled, and coming from inside the well. It was too indistinct to make out words, but it was human. It sounded like someone was whispering through a thick rag. I backed up, grabbing my duffel bag. I had to leave. This was madness. Criminals I could handle, this was something else. But before I could turn, the winch suddenly gave a short, violent groan. The cable jumped, and the massive metal lever, the brake, slammed violently down, releasing the drum. The heavy cable began to spool out, instantly and rapidly, dropping into the well with a terrifying, rhythmic clanging against the stone walls. Something heavy was being dropped, fast, into the abyss. I stood frozen. I knew I couldn't stop it. The groaning and clanging lasted maybe 30 seconds before the drum snapped to a sudden, violent stop. The silence that followed was immense. And then the whispering from the well intensified. It was louder now, closer, rising. It sounded like pleading. A moment later, the winch gave a single, terrifying metallic shriek, and the lever shot back up, locking the brake. Then the cable started pulling itself back up, slowly, with a terrible, grinding grrrn that was now deafening. I watched, sickened, as the heavy, wet cable slowly emerged from the hole, winding itself back onto the drum. I could hear the whispering underneath me, getting weaker, struggling. Finally, the end of the cable appeared. It was thick, knotted, and stained with black grime, and something that looked like fresh, dark blood. Tied to the very end of the cable was a small, white canvas sack. The sack was swinging slightly, completely motionless, and from inside the canvas I could hear the faint, muffled sound of a phone ringing. The machine had brought something up, something that was ringing. I stood there, paralyzed by the horror and the desperate need to know. I crept forward, my ribs protesting with every step. I reached the cable and used my knife to cut the heavy knots binding the sack. I pulled the canvas open. Inside was a satellite phone. The ringing was an incoming call, and a large, blood-caked, ceramic human tooth. It was the size of a thumb, and it was still slightly warm. I grabbed the phone. The caller ID was blocked. I answered it, my voice a ragged croak. "Hello?" A voice, distorted and high-pitched like it was speaking through a fan, came back. "Took your time. I thought you missed the drop." "Who is this? What is this?" I hissed, looking from the giant tooth in my hand to the black well. "The drop. You were late. I had to feed the cable. The price of being late, David. The price of being tracked." The voice paused. 50,000 in Mark 20s, wasn't it? I dropped the tooth. My blood went instantly cold. They knew my name. They knew the money. "How do you know my name? I haven't seen anyone." "The forest sees everything, David, and the well remembers everything. Now the price has gone up. You brought the trackers to my woods. That cash isn't enough." The voice on the phone shifted, becoming lower, more threatening. "You're injured. You won't make it to morning. You have 2 hours to get the duffel bag and come back to the winch. You need to take the next ride down. You pay the full price or I leave you for the wolves. But the wolves are too slow and the winch is hungry." Who was this entity that controlled a mechanical horror? And why did it need me to willingly take the cable ride down that black hole? I looked at the black smoke still rising in the distance, marking my location for the police. Then I looked at the dark well, which had just pulled up a human tooth and a phone. I was caught between two kinds of death, and the monstrous machine was now my only way out. I squeezed the duffel bag tight, the heavy cash feeling meaningless. I took a painful, shuddering breath and started dragging myself back toward the winch, knowing that the price for my freedom was about to be paid in full, and it wasn't going to be with money. Story 8. I thought the silence was the worst of it. I was wrong. The silence was just the prelude. My name is Finn. I'm a wildlife sound recordist. My job is to capture the sounds of the deep, untouched wilderness, the calls of rare owls, the low-frequency vibrations of migrating elk. I was miles into the Cascade Range, nestled in a small, isolated valley where 3 canyons converged. I had set up an elaborate, multi-channel sound array, high-gain microphones strung between the trees, running back to a recorder hidden beneath a granite slab. For 3 days, the recordings were perfect: wind, water, and pure, crystalline animal sounds. Then, on the 4th morning, I pulled the memory card to check the previous night's capture, and I found the anomaly. It was a recording from the microphone pointed straight into the mouth of the deepest, darkest canyon. It started with the natural sounds of the night, the chirps and rustles. But around 3 a.m., everything went completely quiet. Not a sudden drop, but a gradual fade, as if the sound had been gently drawn away. And then the hum began. It was a low, steady frequency, almost subsonic, the kind of hum you feel more than hear. It wasn't mechanical and it wasn't harmonic. It was a single, pure, sustained tone that never changed pitch or volume, lasting for exactly 7 minutes. It sounded like the planet sighing. I pulled off my headphones, chills running down my spine. I ran a quick spectrum analysis on the recording. The hum was completely unique, unlike any atmospheric or electrical interference. I tried to rationalize it, a seismic event, a geological echo chamber. But the quiet preceding it felt deliberate, almost intelligent. That afternoon, I hiked up the canyon, following the direction of the microphone. The deeper I went, the stranger the silence became. It was a physical weight pressing on my eardrums. I found the source of the silence about a mile in, a perfectly circular stand of dead trees. Massive pines, all bleached white, stripped of every needle and branch, forming a silent ring maybe 50 feet across. It was like a forest cemetery, and the air inside the ring was still, cold, and utterly devoid of sound. I snapped my fingers. Nothing. The sound was swallowed instantly. I left a new, high-sensitivity microphone in the center of the ring, pointed straight up at the sliver of sky above. I hiked back to my camp, fighting a growing sense of dread. I knew better than to stay, but my professional curiosity was now a desperate, paralyzing fear. I had to know what the hum was. That night I sat by the recorder, staring at the timeline display. I didn't sleep. Around 2:45 a.m., the lines on all 3 of my external canyon microphones began to dip. The volume of the night sound slowly, meticulously, dropped to 0. The valley went silent again. And on the monitor displaying the microphone in the dead zone, the hum started. I grabbed the headphones, adjusted the gain, and listened. It was the same low frequency, the same powerful, sustained vibration. 7 minutes. But this time I heard something else, something I hadn't caught before. Just beneath the hum, right at the edge of audibility, was a faint, high-pitched chittering. Like hundreds of tiny, anxious mouths clicking rapidly, a frantic counterpoint to the deep tone. And then the hum stopped. But the chittering didn't. It went completely silent on my external microphones, but the one in the dead zone kept recording. The chittering got louder, faster, closer. It sounded like sand pouring through a crack, or maybe thousands of fingernails scratching at a window pane. Then a single sound cut through the chaos, clear and utterly familiar. My own voice, slightly distorted but unmistakably me. It was a line I muttered to myself every night as I set up camp. Another day done, another day clean. Had the hum recorded my voice from the surrounding air, or had it been storing it, waiting for the proper moment to play it back? The chittering stopped, the recording ended, the silence returned. I ripped the headphones off. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echoing off the trees. The thing in the dead zone wasn't just making sounds, it was collecting them, and now it was demonstrating what it had learned. I decided I was leaving immediately. I packed my minimal gear, but I couldn't leave the recorder. I yanked the memory card from the machine, the latest recording of my voice stored safely inside. As I grabbed my pack, I saw it, a tiny detail I hadn't noticed before. Etched into the surface of the granite slab that concealed my recorder, a new line had been scraped. Not a casual scratch, but a deep, clean groove, like someone had dragged a piece of razor-sharp metal across the stone. The groove was an arrow, pointing directly away from my camp, straight up the hill, toward the highest, most inaccessible ridge of the valley. I followed the direction of the arrow. It was a barely there animal track, steep and treacherous. I had to know. The paranoia was no longer controllable. It was demanding to be fed. I hiked for 40 minutes, pushing through thick manzanita and loose shale until I reached the crest of the ridge. The wind here was fierce and cold. I looked down the other side of the ridge. It was a massive, mile-wide plateau, completely flat, covered in pale yellow grass, and in the center of the plateau there was a single, immense structure. It was a tower, not metal or wood, but a crude, organic tower of bones and petrified wood, spiraling 80 feet into the sky. It wasn't built, it was woven, the pale ribs and femurs of countless animals locked together with hardened sap. And at the very top of the tower, in the dim, pre-dawn light, I saw the reason for the hum and the chittering. There were 6 figures standing on the narrow platform at the summit. They were tall, gaunt, and impossibly thin, draped in loose, dark fabric that snapped in the wind. They were motionless, staring out over the vast, silent plains. But what they were doing was the true horror. They were holding long, thin rods like antennae, connected by wires to a central, rotating spool. They were holding the rods perfectly still, and the wires were vibrating. I realized what I was looking at. They were the source of the hum. They weren't using machines. They were using some kind of natural, organic structure to generate that low-frequency sound. Then one of the figures moved. It raised one arm, and I saw a flash of silver in its hand. It was one of my high-gain parabolic microphones. The figure turned the dish, slowly, deliberately, and pointed it down the ridge straight at me. I threw myself flat, scrambling behind a low cluster of shale. My heart felt like it was going to tear through my chest. The figure didn't move the microphone again. It just held it there, perfectly steady. Then, through the fierce wind whipping around my ears, I heard a faint, high-pitched sound. It was the chittering, very close, but coming not from the tower, but from the ground right beside my head. I looked down. There was a small, almost invisible crack in the shale, and a tiny microphone wire, thin as thread, was feeding out of the crack, running straight toward my position. The chittering was traveling up the wire. Were the figures using the hum to search for sounds? And was the chittering the sound of the entire valley's collected microphones, all reporting my location at once? I snatched up a piece of rock and smashed the wire. The chittering stopped instantly. But the silence was replaced by a massive, sustained cello tone, the full volume of the hum, now broadcasting directly down the canyon. It was so loud it was physically painful, vibrating the teeth in my head. I couldn't stay. I scrambled up, ignoring the agonizing hum, and started running straight down the far side of the ridge, away from the valley. As I ran, I looked back once. The figures on the bone tower had turned their backs on the plateau. They were facing the canyon, and they were all pointing at the small, narrow notch in the earth where my camp had been. They hadn't needed the microphone. They knew where I was going, and the hum wasn't just a signal. It was a beacon, drawing something else in. I ran until the hum was just a deep, meaningless ache in my chest, knowing I had stumbled into a conversation that was ancient and deadly, and that the only thing keeping me alive was my ability to keep moving faster than sound.